Hello and good morning and good afternoon to you all. Thanks for taking part in our issues forum on racism as a thief in the night, how racist beliefs impact employment opportunities and perpetuate economic inequities. I'm Mark Harden, Executive Director of the Gospel Initiative. And the Gospel Initiative is a program of Denver Seminary. And our purpose is to assist churches in creating a compelling and credible presence in society. Our churches range, not just churches rather, but also ministry practitioners, ministry leaders, students, and educators in ministry as well. We're so glad to have you here. This is our second issues forum. We're completing and in the middle of our series on racism, particularly systemic racism. And our issue today, we have three guests as a panelist for our discussion today. So I want to take the moment to introduce them, but first introduce our technician and coordinator of the Gospel Initiative, Jason Woodman, who will be behind the scenes working to make sure that we have a great learning experience and time talking together about this important issue. First, I want to introduce to you Steve McMullen. Steve McMullen comes to us as an associate professor of economics at Hope College. As any good academic and economist, he's a part of he's an executive editor with the Journal of Faith and Economics, and he has a podcast on faithful economy. So we're glad to have Steve with us. Some of the things that he has done is published on animals in the economy. He's co-authored book on digital life together and the changing landscape of Christian schools with Eerdmans is his latest publication in 2020. Dr. McMullen's research interests include inequality, consumerism, and educational policy, in addition to animal and environmental ethics, and also theology. So we're glad to have Dr. McMullen from Hope College with us. Our next panelist is Mark Mulder. Mark Mulder is a professor of sociology at Calvin University. His scholarship focuses around urban congregations and neighborhoods and changing racial and ethnic demographics and the impact of that change. He's the author of several publications. One of his first publications is Shades of White Flight, Evangelical Congregations and Urban Departure, which was published in 2015, and those that follow with Congregations and Neighborhoods and Places. In addition, he's co-authored Latino Protestants in America, Growing and Diverse. And the latest book is The Glass Church, Robert Schuller, The Crystal Cathedral and the Stain of Meta Church Ministry. So we're also glad to have Dr. Mark Miller with us from Calvin University. Our third panelist that I would like to introduce to you is Dr. Samuel Zelanga. And Dr. Zelanga is a professor of sociology and former chair of the Department of Sociology and Reconciliation Studies at Bethel University in St. Paul, Minnesota. He's the associate editor also and has published many works. His specialization is in development studies and social change. Dr. Zelanga is a former Fulbright scholar, twice a fellow of the Carnegie African Diaspora, and he has been the director of research and publication in African studies, being a native Nigerian. And what he looks to in terms of his interests is origin, nature, operations, and consequences of neoliberalism and its implication for the struggle for a more just, fair, and inclusive society. Now, so we're taking, as you can see, an interdisciplinary approach to looking at distressed economic communities and the influence and the impact of systemic racism and how it creates barriers for residents in these communities in relation to the larger society. So with that being said, I will give them a chance to say hello, make sure their mic is working.
Hello.
Thank you, Steve.
Glad to be here.
Hello.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Now, we have distinguished scholars with us, but I'm going to be referring to Steve as Steve McMullen as Steve, and Mark Mulder as Mark, and Samuel Zelanga, who is also a friend of mine, as Sam. So we can go forward with that. We live in a very divisive era. And so this topic that comes to us, I think, gets overlooked with all of the hot issues of today in some regard, even though we're couching it in terms of racial barriers that are created by disparities and inequities in our economic life of communities. So when we think about distressed communities, we often think of them in deficit terms, right? We think of that neighborhood or that those poor people are socially disadvantaged. I don't want to focus on the people per se, even though that's an important feature of our discussion, but I want to kind of talk about more of the environment and the challenges it presents, specifically as it relates to how systemic issues such as racial barriers are feed into these communities or perpetuate themselves. So first, I want to start off with a question that's directed towards Steve McMullen and Mark. How does unemployment, in your opinion, impact low-income households compared to other households? And why should we who are not impacted by unemployment care what's happening in these communities or among these families? Steve?
I'll start, Mark, if you don't mind.
Go ahead.
First of all, thanks, Mark Harden, for pulling this together. This is a great topic. It's really good to be talking about these things with you guys today, and it's and I'm excited to learn here. On the topic of unemployment, I like to note that the risk of unemployment is not borne equally across the population. That some of us work in the kinds of industries where losing your job just isn't a huge risk. I'd point to like education and healthcare as industries that are pretty stable, right? But there's other kinds of jobs and other kinds of industries where the risk of unemployment is very real. You can think of industries like construction, where there's a lot of volatility. People lose their jobs and they gain their jobs, and sometimes they have a lot of work to do and sometimes they don't. And when it comes right down to it, if you look at the distribution, like there's communities where a whole lot of people are working in some of these industries that are really volatile. And that can just be really hard on the whole community because when folks lose their jobs, that hurts their ability to support their families and contribute to their community and these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. The other note that I'd give here real quick is just that education matters a lot. So if you can get to the higher levels of education, it seems to be able to get you into the kinds of jobs that are a lot more stable as well. So the unemployment rate today among folks with a college education is like 3.7%, and the economy is not that great right now. But if you look at the unemployment rate among folks with less than a high school degree, it's more like 8%. And it's normal for folks without a high school degree to have like twice the probability of being unemployed as folks with a college degree. And that tells you something about the stability of the jobs that are available to folks with less education. Okay. So those are the big things that pop out to me, at least right from the start.
Yeah, before you speak, Mark, I do have a comment. So Steve, what do you do with the numbers that we're seeing in terms of the disparities of unemployment? So it's not so much the bad neighborhood or the neighborhood that has less resources compared to the neighborhood that has a lot of resources. But the divide is also based on race. Yes. That the likelihood of you getting a job is 10 times higher than somebody like me getting a job, for instance. Why? So even though we can note education, I have just as much or more education than you. So can you speak to that? What's up with that?
Well, there's a whole lot of layers to this, and what I like to remind folks is when we're starting to think about race and unemployment, the obvious problem is discrimination in the labor market. There is discrimination, and it just folks in minority communities will just have to apply for many, many more jobs to get the same kind of attention that a white person will get with the same resume. So we know that.
Okay.
But it's more than that, right? There's layers to it, because there's also educational disparities, and those educational disparities layer on top, right? And there's lots of, and then there's industry differences, like I mentioned. And so we have to just note that these things aren't all independent. It's that folks in a minority community will often have the educational disparities, but they'll also be working in a volatile industry, and there'll be the discrimination in the labor market on top of that. And these things all come together to make the problem especially difficult.
Okay, and Mark, and I would like you to answer that question, but also with the emphasis of the question is also, why should we care?
Okay.
Those of us who are doing well.
Okay, so let me, as a sociologist, I think about these things a little bit differently than Steve. And I was first nervous we're going to say the same things, but I'm glad we see the economic disparity in disciplines. So when I think about unemployment, it's disruptive to whoever experiences. It's going to be disruptive to their family. The difference is that wealth can provide a buffer. And when you look at the differences when it comes to race and how much wealth a white family has according to an African-American or Latinx family, I believe the latest figures are 10 to 12 times as much wealth. And a lot of that, because they have that wealth barrier, you can be less vulnerable. So when I think of what unemployment means for low-income families, by definition, they're going to have less wealth, they're going to have less savings, they're not going to have as good of a pension. And so when they are experiencing an unemployment bout, it has much more potential, I think, for catastrophic economic and social consequences, just because they're extremely vulnerable. Because they have not had the opportunity to build up the wealth that can protect them through a bout or a spate or a spell of unemployment. And so I think it's really significant to remember that, we have an official poverty line that says about, 38 to 40 million people or so are living in official poverty in the United States. But we have another almost 15 million who are what we call nearly in poverty, or the nearly poor, and they are not much better off. In some ways, they're maybe more vulnerable because they don't have access, because of their relative income, to some of the social safety net supports. And so that's what I think of what unemployment can do to low-income households as compared to others. And then, Mark, the second part of your question was, why should we care? As a Christian, to me, it's so obvious that these are people. They have dignity. They're image bearers of God. And I come out of the Reformed commitment, and we talk about shalom, and what God really intends is for everyone to flourish. Mm-hmm. And so when we have a society where a good portion of people are not allowed to flourish, and we see that's breaking down based on racial categories, we know that something's baked into the system, that the shade of a person's skin actually has outcomes for their employment opportunities and their ability to thrive as a human being. And so as a Christian, I think it should prick our conscience. We should not be satisfied that fellow image bearers of God are not being able to flourish in the way that I would assume God had intended.
Great, thank you. Let me continue with you, Mark, for a moment. Let's assume that Christians aren't caring enough. God forbid, but let's assume that for now. That means that these communities and these families within the communities that don't have as much opportunity or resources or wealth, as you put it, there's a lot of things that happen. And one of the things that comes to my mind is isolation. That's, if you ask me what is the most destructive force in the community, I would say being in isolation. I mean, there's mental health, there's economics, there's social, I mean, the list goes on. Can you speak to that? Why are there some neighborhoods that are more handicapped than others? because of
Yeah.
isolation? And what does that
Yeah,
look like?
and I think you're using a fairly benign term there,
Okay.
Mark. I mean, I think it's generous of you to say that it's just isolation. I would say, as a sociologist, I'd say there's social exclusion going on. That
Okay.
these are places where people are pushed to and left aside, and it's a lot of times it's places where people don't choose to live there, but they don't have a lot of options. So it's marginalized people, and then they become more and more socially excluded and more outside of the rest of society, and they lose more and more opportunities to fully integrate. And so it becomes almost a vicious cycle. And what happens is that these places become sites of concentrated poverty, and they have less and less access to what middle class people would assume are necessities. And to transportation, good health care, good access to affordable groceries. And so what ends up happening is that they don't get to fully participate in society because of that social exclusion. And so we like to talk about the freedoms that we enjoy in the United States, but sociologically we would say the more wealth you have, the more freedom you have. That people who are in poverty actually don't get to be as free as people who have wealth. So for instance, I can drive my car to Costco and actually get to save money because I have discretionary income. But what Costco assumes is that I'm not arriving on a bus, because it's buying in bulk, and there's an assumption of discretionary income. And so it actually takes money to save money, some discretionary income. And so we have systems built in that preclude people who are already somewhat marginalized, and then they're already socially marginalized, but then when they become geographically marginalized, I think it just ratchets up, and it almost becomes a cycle that's really difficult to break out of.
Well, let me, in the spirit of politeness, let me bring up another term, and for you, and also I'd like to hear from you, Sam, regarding being socially disadvantaged. I mean, that's another term that we hear all the time and that we use. There are community-based organizations that are established in communities to deal with all plethora of issues and problems in these so-called socially disadvantaged communities. Can you give us some ideas of how they make up the difference or fill the step in the gap for some of these lack of opportunities and resources that you're talking about? What are some of the steps?
Are you asking me, Mark, or do you want Samuel to?
I want you both to respond.
Okay.
Let me start with Sam on this one.
That makes sense.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Well, so you're talking about the organizations, what the organizations are doing within such communities, right?
Yes.
Okay. First, we have to understand what the socially disadvantaged community really is. It is a community of people who have been subjected to racial, ethnic, or sometimes cultural bias or discrimination and things like that. And on that basis, they are treated really differently. The important thing about social disadvantage that I want the listener also to understand is that the person is being treated in a different way, not because the person treating him or her knows anything about them as an individual. It is just because they happen to come or they belong to a certain group, and that's why they are treated that way. And that can be really, really very painful because somebody doesn't know anything about you, but just because they look at you, you belong to this group, then that. So if we want to understand the contribution that organizations are making in this kind of communities, we have to understand what are the disadvantages that these communities do face. So one of them, for instance, is the question of, some people will say, lack of social capital, which is a point that I think Mark made reference to indirectly. Social capital in plain language simply means the kind of social network and relationships that people really use. And this is really very important because much earlier there was a discussion on employment, but even employment today, sometimes the networking relationship is really, really very important. I have known some people who got positions that otherwise they wouldn't have gotten, but because of the social network. So people in those kind of communities lack social networks. So an organization that is trying to bring about transformation in this kind of community would have to do something about how people in this community can build network of relationship. And then the other thing is cultural capital, knowledge base. Knowledge is really very, very important. And given the kind of society we live in the United States, if you don't have even an understanding of how the political system operates or the economic system, the complexity and all those kind of things, it can be really it can put you at a disadvantage. But more than that, as they mentioned much earlier regarding the gap between people who are college educated and those that are not in terms of getting employment. So cultural capital becomes very important here, which means your skill set. How can we help these people to get certain kind of skills? And the reason why this is really very important, I'm sorry to say, but in a capitalist society, one of the important ways you can be relevant is through your human capital. Because capitalists are not just going to, in a capitalist economy, you're not just going to be employed or whatever just because of that, because you're going to be employed there. You have to have some value addition that you're going to bring to the organization. If you don't, then I'm really sorry that it's going to be very difficult for somebody. So knowledge base and then trust. Those organizations can find ways to build trust within the community, because Francis Fukuyama, for instance, argued that you can't even talk about a market economy without trust. Okay, if we don't have trust among ourselves, it's going to be a problem. So these are just some of the things I want to say about that.
So let me push you a little bit on that in terms of practical, and then I'll let both Steve and Mark comment. But what is the, so churches are in communities. They're in the poorest communities often. What is it that they're doing at a practical level that provides support? I understand the trust piece. That's kind of easy, but on a practical level, what is, I mean, also we know that they're caring for their souls, which is the obvious answer, thank God. But really, what, how are they complementing what these community-based organizations are trying to do to help these people feel whole and to help them make some progress in their struggles?
Okay, so in the first place, I think one of the ways that the church can make a huge difference, and being probably a minority person, I've experienced this myself, and I've seen it among a lot of people, is this sense of even the affirmation of someone's self-esteem. There are many people who are struggling with this whole idea of what their identity is, right? Especially if you talk about the youth, for instance, what is my identity or whatever. And I think the church is playing a very important role in trying to encourage or build the confidence of young people, because if somebody is destroyed from outside, I know we're talking a lot about outside, a lot this and that, but the church can do a lot in building the confidence of young people, because if you are destroyed from inside, and I have experienced that, if you're destroyed from inside, you just lose hope. There's nothing you can do. So the church plays a very important role in that respect in terms of building the confidence. But in other respects, the church can also practically help by connecting many members of this of the church with many other organizations. Sometimes they invite people to come to the church to make either presentations, and then the youth are educated on what do they really need, because sometimes, I'm sorry to say, children may grow up or youth may grow up in a very disadvantaged environment, as we discussed, as was highlighted much earlier. They may not know what is the basic things that are needed in order, or the social skills that are necessarily needed in mainstream American society. So the church can play a very important role in educating the young in this respect, so that they can become aware. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. So let me just ask in general, Steve, do you have any comments, or Mark, that you thought you would like to add to that?
I would say, yeah. So, and I want to continue with Samuel's notion of social capital, because I think there's other ways to think about it. I think churches actually have quite a bit of social capital in their neighborhoods that they often don't spend. And so if you want to think about ways that churches can come alongside or enhance the work of other nonprofits that are doing neighborhood work, I think they have voices that they don't necessarily always use. So one of the good examples that I have of this is, I'm originally from Wisconsin, and the current mayor of Milwaukee, every year he has a ceasefire Sabbath. And the reason why he does that is he travels around to core city congregations and says, can I use your pulpit to deliver a message? He says, I have a responsibility as a politician, as a mayor, but my voice is limited compared to what you have. You are here 7 days a week in this neighborhood. And I think I would like to be on your shoulders to try to, I need you vouching for this message. And so I think that's what, I think, here in Michigan, we have an affordable housing crisis in Grand Rapids. And part of the reason is we don't have inclusionary zoning. Inclusionary zoning means that if anytime you want to build something, you have to build some affordable housing as part of the package. That if we had something on the books like that, we could really start to take a bite out of some of that affordable housing crisis. And I think churches could be a part of that. If churches were lobbying the Capitol for something like inclusionary zoning, that's a real systemic solution, not a one-off, but a program that's baked into how we build things that could be effective. And so, I also think we forget that congregations, churches are volunteer factories. That nobody volunteers as much as church attenders. We also know that churches are educational factories. What they're doing, part of their warp and woof is educating people. And so they also have facilities. Most of them have buildings that 6 days of the week don't get a lot of use. And so these are underutilized facilities. So I just think part of this is congregations realizing all the resources and capacities that they have that perhaps might be underutilized. And I think one of the tasks is for congregations to be more aware of the social capital that they have to spend. And I think that would be an interesting way for them to start thinking about how they can engage their places or their neighborhoods.
Thank you. It seems to me that that you're saying that churches have a wealth of assets that are underutilized often, and
Yes.
particularly as it relates to these communities.
Yes.
And I also hear you saying, and I'm really not trying to put words in your mouth, is that oftentimes these people in the communities don't have a voice. And the relationship that the church have with its community can function as that voice. And that's a major component because many of the solutions are systemic based solutions, right? Like housing, as you did, for example. That sounds, that's incredible that those kind of opportunities are right in front of us. That's absolutely incredible in my view. Steve, did you want to say anything? I kind of jumped in. Don't want to present you.
No,
but
I would just be adding, frosting on top of what Mark and Sam have already said. So I'll let it stand.
Okay. Well, let me look more toward your neck of the woods in terms of business. As I was growing up, I used to hear in Detroit that some businesses were leaving. And actually, one of you wrote a book on flight, but in Detroit, white flight is remembered because during a certain part in the 70s, there was great white flight in which all of the resources were leaving Detroit. So people were saying, well, if you're going to have a Black mayor, we're leaving. And as a consequence, insurance rates went up for businesses who stayed because they feared redlining for housing, purchase of housing happened. It was right across 8 Mile, which was the border of Detroit and the suburbs. And so if you bought a house, the rates were high, the insurance were high, the jobs were less, the resource. I mean, it was just like a dominoes effect. And I lived through that era. And so I thought about asking you this question, Steve. What about businesses that do come to communities that are economically distressed as predators? What's the impact of predatory businesses that you know about, and how and to what extent and in what ways does predatory business practices undermine a community's ability to thrive or flourish?
Well, that's a great question, and there's a couple of layers to this. One would be just the fact of businesses leaving. And the co-location of businesses with the already most privileged neighborhoods, and actually co-location of churches with the most privileged neighborhoods. Right? These have a real effect of just separating the folks who are already being excluded from the kind of economic opportunities that they need to have some kind of financial independence and support their families and whatnot. So I think that's a problem independent, but this other layer of businesses that are predatory does add real damage on top of that. So let me first tell you what I think a predatory business is. It's the kind of definition I like is pretty broad, but it's any business that's taking advantage of people's need or people's lack of social capital in order to get them to accept a deal that's unethical or illegal or just really bad deal. And once you start thinking about what businesses are basically using a power move on people like this, there's actually lots of examples of them, right? So you can think about really low quality education institutions that are maybe not accredited, that give people degrees that don't have real value, when in exchange for thousands of dollars. But then the folks don't have the skills they need to do the job that they're dreaming of doing. Or you can think about payday lending companies that will take advantage of short-term need for credit for folks that don't have the wealth to fall back on, but then charge really high interest rates, right? And people end up losing a lot of their income for lack of credit. Or there's employers who refuse to pay their workers when they're working overtime or demand that they work off the clock. But this is particularly a problem for folks who are undocumented, who will be afraid of reporting their employer. Right? There's a huge power problem there, but that's wage theft. It's illegal, it's not punished nearly enough, and it's all too common. Multi-level marketing companies that promise the ability to work from home, but then ask you to put a whole bunch of your own money in to get started, and then the opportunity you're buying into is terrible. I could go on, right? But we all see these businesses all over the place. And we see what they're doing, right? They're taking folks that are in the worst spot economically. They're offering them opportunities. But those opportunities aren't good ones, and they end up just extracting what little wealth already exists in these communities, often without offering much in return. Now, of course, unfortunately, these kind of businesses often target communities of color. Because these are the places that are already lower in social capital and lower in other kinds of connections, and often where some of the laws are not enforced well enough. And I mean, the problem is a big one. I could tell you how I want to fix it, but it's not a simple fix, because part of the problem is that the businesses that could offer a real alternative to folks are leaving. And as the way you stated the question, I think is great, is that these are the kind of businesses that can only thrive in communities that are not being served, right? Payday lending only thrives in a community that doesn't have access to good credit, right? By credit unions and other kinds of financial institutions. Bad, low quality sort of scam educational institutions only thrive when there aren't good educational institutions competing with them. For those same students. So, and then I still think there's lots of enforcement we could do. We could regulate this better. We could do a lot more to make sure these places don't have the ability to take advantage of people as well. But I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you. That you really drew a good picture of kind of what is beneath the surface when we look at these communities. There's a lot going on. Yeah. They're fighting demons. They're fighting all types of evils, if you will, in the name of surviving, and they're exploited at the same time. So I appreciate that answer. Sam, let me go to you about, I was in Boston, and as you know, I worked there in Boston for a number of years. And what boggles the mind is that when Boston's transportation system is kind of second to none. I mean, you're 5 minutes from any transit system, 5-minute walk. So you can go anywhere. A lot of people in Boston, because of housing shortages, live way outside the city. And so they have to come in. And so the biggest challenges I recall right now there are transportation and housing for people who work in the city. But recently, it was brought to my attention that now that the mayor had become the Secretary of Labor, that for the first time they have a woman as mayor of Boston, which you never would have thought of, never would have thought of. And many of the power brokers and the government leaders and officials were often Anglo-Americans of some sort. Okay, I don't want to get into stereotyping, but Boston is an old town in which stereotyping was abundant. And so I'm trying to figure out, my question is not that I'm trying to villainize the government or I'm anti-government, is what maintains these systems of exclusion, as Mark Mulder puts it, in a city like that, where things are prioritized and those who have less resources are put at a very disadvantage when it comes to housing, transportation, et cetera?
Okay, this is an interesting and a very important question. Interestingly, we just finished reading Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and a lot of these things have been explored there. But I think one of the things, even based on what was said by Steve and then Mark, is just that I would like to comment on is that when we talk about what the church can do, I want us to bear in mind that if one looks at the mission of the church and then compare it with the mission of the market, because as Steve described, I'm sorry to say, I don't think I have taught religion for some time. And I think there's a way in which the Christian vision of a community is different from that of the market. Okay, so if the market is really going to be serving the Christian or in the community, I think Christians would have to really think seriously about what is the logic, what is the ethical commitment that is driving the market compared to what is the ethical commitment that is driving the church. Because what the market does is it sorts out people. It sorts us out, either based on income or based on all those kind of things. So when you talk about the way things are happening in Boston and things like that, you look at politics, for instance. If we want to regulate, for instance, or we want more money to be spent in terms of doing good for certain disadvantaged neighborhood and things like that, I am sorry to say that there are Christian churches who are supporting politicians who actually oppose this kind of investment that we're really talking about that would make a difference. Because Christianity or the Christian community is a very large one, okay? And so when you look at the patterns of votings, you find out that this whole idea of regulating the economy, as you said, predatory lending and things like that, actually, when I look at it from my own point of view, because sometimes when you think about this logic of willing buyer and willing seller, they say it's once there's a willing buyer and willing seller, no matter what result comes out of it, it's legitimate. It may be unfortunate, but it's legitimate because nobody forced you to get into that. So there are many.
Excuse me, I want to push there a minute. Are you saying that churches, but churches are part of are a force in maintaining the status quo, where the barriers have been erected and other inequities are bound?
Yes, I wouldn't say all churches, but definitely there are churches that are like that.
Okay.
They are part of the system. I just prepared a lecture recently on the American Civil War, and I was shocked to see how Christians draw arguments from the Bible to justify slavery, and then some Christians draw arguments from the Bible against slavery. Now, we may think this is just something that happened in the past, but if we look today, you can think about anything that is happening in this country. You're going to find out that there are certain parts of the Christian community that support politicians. They know very well that these politicians are doing things that are worsening the situation in these minority communities, but some of these members of the church, some of these churches are really supporting them. Let's be frank about that, okay?
Okay.
But yeah.
So then, and I was just trying to bring light to part of the issue of disparity has also to do with sometimes, rather wittingly or unwittingly, we play into the status quo as well. That's kind of what I'm taking away. Yes. I want to switch a little bit, if you don't mind, with the time we have and allow for some other questions, to take a theological lens and a practical lens and bring them together as it relates to a well-known story that Jesus shares with us in the Gospels. Jesus talks about the Good Samaritan, which is an oxymoron in many sense, right? This Samaritan takes a journey down Jericho Road. And I know you know the story, so let me give a quick synopsis. In this story, the Samaritan sees that this person has been robbed and left on the road to die. And he responds, but before he responds and sees this person, two religious figures in the community walk by and do nothing in that regard. And as I was reflecting on that story, a lot of images came to my mind in terms of how can the church, how can we learn from, use this story as an analogy to instruct us and to help us think about our role in these communities, whether we're in and a part of the community or whether we're in a neighboring community in regards to these individuals. Because I think Steve would agree that economics is more regional than it is by neighborhood, so because most people who need jobs and are employed often leave their neighborhood to make a living so that they could feed their children. But in this case, we could use this story. I would like to know your insights and what do you think we can draw from that story in regards to our topic today?
So, Mark, I think it's a really dangerous story. I think the lawyer got more than he wanted because when you start spinning that story out, Jesus makes being a neighbor much more complicated than, sharing a casserole when somebody's having a baby or, greeting each other over the fence.
Okay.
I mean, think about, I mean, as a sociologist, I see policy implications in the Good Samaritan. First of all, why is that road so dangerous? Maybe we should have better, more secure, safer roads. Okay. Look at the fact that his neighbor is someone who's different than him, right? I mean, we have a nation that's in an upheaval right now, and a lot of it is because we have a good portion of the people who look like Steve and me, who are concerned about the changing racial demographics, and they're scared of that. Then there's also the issue that it costs. It costs to be a good neighbor. The Good Samaritan loses time and money in taking care of this person he doesn't know. And so I think as a society and as members of a church, we have to realize so a person like me who was born with privileges that I did not earn, I have to be willing to give some things up, that there are costs to being a good neighbor, to having better policy, which allows for more people to flourish. So I see, as a sociologist, I see policy spinning out of that story.
Okay, interesting, very interesting. News to me, very insightful, I think, as well. Thank you for that. Steve, your thoughts before I talk?
My first thought is, we keep talking about communities and neighborhoods as if they're distinct places, and that there's a big separation. And the problem, of course, is that the separations between neighborhoods and communities are artificial, but they're built, right, in a lot of ways. And so the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is that we spend a lot of time, at least people who live even in neighborhoods very close to where I live right now, spend a lot of time trying to fix the rules so that the folks who live around them look like them, so that they won't ever meet a Samaritan on the road. And we do that through zoning laws, and we do that through school districts and property taxes and a whole bunch of things, so that and our churches are not, let's just say they're not resisting too often, right? They're not resisting because anyway, the result is, of course, that we don't get these encounters, and that our church communities aren't stepping up and living up to this example, because we think of our neighbors as the ones who are close to us, who look like us, right? So much of the conversation we've had today would be so different if we didn't have those divides between neighborhoods and communities, so that we were able to invest in each other and we were sharing in the same public institutions and these kinds of things. So it strikes me that there's a policy solution, that pops to mind when I read this story and I think about this conversation. And it has a lot to do with the walls that we're building to keep us away from or separating our neighborhoods in really weirdly artificial ways across very short distances.
Do you think that there is much economy in being a good neighbor or being neighborly to a stranger or embracing our differences across geographic and ethnic bound,
You know, of course, you know, so we only become prosperous as a society and as a community when we're able to fruitfully learn and engage and trade with each other and live together in peace. And to the degree that we draw lines and put up walls and whatnot, we're just separating ourselves, and we're all poorer as a result. Right? That's unambiguous. So that has to do with building trust in the community, and the more trust you have in the community, the more everybody benefits. So yes, broadly speaking, we're all better off when we all live together in peace, right? The problem, of course, is that these divisions serve other interests as well, right? And in particular, they serve those of us with privileges and power.
Okay, Sam, what are your thoughts?
This is an issue that I've been really interested in for quite some time. But with regard to first, before I comment on what they have said, but with regard to the Good Samaritan, I think one of the things that comes to my mind is this idea of shared humanity. Okay, I always, sometimes before I start teaching a course, tell the students to bring the answer to these two questions on the first day of class. What does it mean to be human, and what do we owe each other for being human? And given the fact that we live in a country that is multi-religious, multi-ethnic, there's a lot of diversity. First, what I want the students to grapple with is, what does it mean to be human? I don't initially want to know whether the person is even a Christian or whatever, and what do we owe each other. For me, this is the foundation of building, understanding and building a good society. And I think what happened there, it seems to me, was just that there's no that idea of shared humanity. Somebody doesn't have to be a Christian, but they can understand the importance of that shared humanity. The other thing that came out of that for me was people, actually, the greatest war we have in America is not between atheists and believers, but it is among people who believe in God, but God doesn't mean the same thing to them. When you check very carefully, when you study them very carefully, you find out that one might say, both of them or all of them might say they believe God, but when you check very carefully, you find out that so the nature of the other person's God is not the same as the other person's God, because if it is the same, that God cannot be giving them diametrically opposed visions of human society as such. So, so this is it. And then the other thing I want to just comment, which I see as a challenge, is just that teaching social inequality made me to understand that if I wake up in the morning and what makes me, is just like a slave master. If the slave master wakes up every morning and he feels what makes him really a full human being is that there's the slave there, then there's a tendency where he wouldn't like the slave to really move up, because if the slave moves up, then it affects his own self-identity. So similarly, when we have this kind of society where we're building our identity about, I am special because I have this, these other people do not have it, we start competing, and this competition makes it difficult for us to really work together. We only work together when we think it is going to serve our interests, but it requires a higher level of maturity to achieve what Steve is talking about. And I think some people call it self-interest properly understood, that it is in my own self-interest, properly well understood, to have a peaceful community. But some people operate with this crude self-interest, homo economicus, this person who is just concerned narrowly about his own self-interest. If something is not going to serve his or her own self-interest, they ignore it. And then at the end of the day, it leads to what some people call tragedy of the commons, because everybody is just looking for, just trying to pursue his or her own narrow self-interest. We end up just having the whole system either collapse or something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I'm going to look to some questions that our audience may have. And let me ask you this question then. With that being said, I mean, I thank you all so much from for communicating. I intentionally asked you to be a part of this for you to speak from your discipline, and you were disciplined in speaking. And I appreciate that because it gave us the multiple perspectives we needed. But now I want you to reach down deep inside, not abandon your discipline and your scholarly studies, but with the state that we're finding things, with the division between Black, brown, and yellow and white people, the aggression toward Asian Americans, the aggression against the government. And I mean, the list goes on, right? We seem to be living in a very divisive area. And so it sort of exacerbated what we already, the racial barriers in particular, and systemic issues that we have. It sort of exacerbated that. So from your vantage point, what would you tell the church? What if you were sitting down with a pastor that you loved and you really wanted to speak to him or her about what they need to do? What would you suggest that the church could do, either in terms of removing barriers, tearing down barriers, or in terms of building bridges and establishing relationships that communities that were disadvantaged or neighborhoods could be impacted in ways that they could be impacted? What would you say? I know it was a long-winded question, but please answer. How would you, what practical ways can a church respond to our situation and that would benefit the divide we have in terms of affluent versus disadvantaged communities?
Well, so I'm a sociologist of religion, but an urban sociologist, and like you said, interested in the intersection of race and religion. And so I continue to be haunted as a Christian by the fact that, you know, the old cliche of 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is still the most segregated hour of the week, and that it's less true than it used to be. I mean, I think some of the recent surveys show that we do have a growing number of multiracial churches. But the fact is, I go to a church and I belong to a denomination that is white supremacist in nature, I think. And so it's incumbent on my church and my denomination to commit to being anti-racist and doing audits of itself about how do we engage in, or how do we maintain white institutional rules? Because we like to think that we are race neutral. But in my tradition, in my denomination, there's no such thing. It's predisposed to benefit white Dutch folks who get the rules, and the rules are so much just the air they breathe that they don't even recognize them. And so I think an important step is for churches like mine to risk some of the ways they've always done things, and to be willing to be vulnerable and say, we need to do an audit of what we're doing that causes us to remain so homogeneous. And what are the changes that we're willing to engage to look more like we should, more diverse, more welcoming, and more engaged with the neighborhood and community around us.
Thank you. Thank you. You just reminded me, one of the, I guess, pillars of the definition of trust is willing to be vulnerable, right? And so the question I reframed in my mind as you were talking is, what are we willing to do as a church to be vulnerable in order to gain or be a part of the community that God has created, or human community? Thanks. Steve, did you have something? Or
you know, I was actually just really interested in hearing how Mark answered this question, because, you know, we confront this with my own church, and it's just such a hard one. But, you know, but I am struck that, you know, there's a political polarization thing going on in your question, in addition to a sort of a racial element as well. And I'm struck by the fact that our churches reflect our communities and reflect our neighborhoods. So, you know, part of this has to do with the fact that we're not living in the same places. People around us tend to agree with us. But sometimes the churches are also, even in diverse neighborhoods, are very uniform, ideologically, politically, racially, culturally. And yet the church has a lot of resources for overcoming this. I have more hope that the church can realize that this is a crisis and can reach across these cultural divides and pull people together, because the church is one of the few places where we could disagree about a lot of stuff, or we could come from really different backgrounds, but we still also have something real that unifies us.
Yeah.
And so my hope is that the church, both my individual congregation, my denomination, but also American Christianity overall, over the next 20 years, takes us on as a big project to say, peacemaking between neighbors is our job. And that means we should be constantly confronted in the pews with people who don't see the world like we do. And if we're not, then we're missing out on something. I don't have the road from here or there, but that does seem to be the mandate.
Yeah, it seems like you're echoing very much what Mark just shared, is that you agree that the church is resource rich in terms of social capital, cultural capital, and all of those nice economic man models, or woman models. But the first step is self-awareness. I agree with that. I think that realization of resources and the realization of who you are and the opportunities before you is absolutely critical first step. Yeah, Sam, did you want to add to that as well, that last question, or
Yes,
do you have different thoughts?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that. You see, the church has resources, but in my point of view, at least from the way I've seen things going on, is that the church has a mission. The market too has a mission. In my view, the market is as evangelistic as evangelical Christianity or Christianity. Okay, evangelical Christianity wants to expand. It wants to transform people's heart, people's consciousness, people's vision, or whatever. But when you study the way the market really operates, and I'm very interested in that, the market cannot succeed without actually expanding, penetrating different areas of human endeavor that used not to be dominated by the market. The market was to control people's vision, people's aspirations, and the church needs to be aware about that. And then I will tell the pastor that I want the pastor, for instance, in this country, to really understand the history of this country, because sometimes we feel like, well, these things happened in the past, so they don't have any impact on us now. It is something different that we're dealing with or whatever. But from my point of view, you can literally trace some of the problems we're dealing with now back to some hundreds of years, the way they evolve up to this point. So there are many pastors that I found out that have this historical awareness and things like that. And then the other thing I will also say is the question of ego, because sometimes what makes there are certain pastors that one of my students was telling me that during politics, some pastors would not even meet in the same place because everyone is concerned about being the most influential or something like that. So ego is there, okay? Mm-hmm. So we have to let go in order for us. There's a certain kind of liberation that comes when I can be satisfied being part of a community and contribute without necessarily being the center of the universe or attention. And then finally, I would like to talk with the pastor and say, Pastor, how does the social and material interests, how does your social and material interests or the social and material interests of your church shape the way you read the Bible and interpret the Bible? Because I found this to be very, very important. This is not just a problem in the United States, it exists in other societies as well. So I have come to a point where I realize the issue is not just even about having the Bible or being a Christian, but when you read the Bible, one has to look at, examine or interrogate his or her subconscious mind, like how does one's social and material interests shape the way they interpret the Bible? Mm-hmm. And when you get into that, you realize that sometimes, and this saddens me very, very much, people know that the truth is there, or they have done something wrong, that they have pursued either their ego or self-interest to create all these problems. But instead of admitting that they made a mistake, they will double down and go into the Bible and look for some excuse to justify that, which is kind of complicated.
Yeah, that's a good point. Sometimes we read the Bible, we're blessed, and sometimes we create a problem if we don't do it prayerfully, for sure. Thank you all for participating in this. I think this was a rich session. I think we talked about ways of approaching the issue from multiple levels, from a policy level all the way down to self-reflection and awareness. And so I think this was a good experiment to bring these perspectives together on an issue at a neighborhood level. I feel that more discussion is needed in this area. And I want to thank you for your contributions, and I feel blessed, and I'm sure our audience will share their thoughts as well until our next time we meet together for the forum on May 13th, which will be talking about health disparities and systemic racism. Again, thank you and good afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Appreciate it.
Thank you
Bye
very
now.
much.